He woke up in front of a broken press and immediately realized three things. The blood on the floor wasn't entirely his. There were two memories in his head, and both were real. And he could reassemble this machine, which someone had smashed to pieces, with his eyes closed, because that was all he'd done for 30 years. The back of his head throbbed as if a nail had been driven into it and twisted. It smells like damp paper, linseed oil, and copper. Blood. He sits up with a jolt. The world is spinning. He clutches his head but no longer thinks about the pain because he's looking at the frame. A rough wooden screw, a pressure plate covered in black streaks, a printing press, a makeshift one, assembled from a wine press and scraps, but a proper one. Someone in this world had almost reached the point of book printing, and that someone was killed. Two lives unfold in his mind. One, Daniel Hawthorne, 27 years old, Portland, restorer of old printing presses, a man who knows the smell of lead type from the year 1480. The second, Edwin Hawthorne, 34, master bookbinder, a widower, the city of Holmgard, the kingdom of Valdren, a world where books are as valuable as castles, and a teacher has his tongue cut out for teaching a peasant to read. Edwin spent 3 weeks assembling this machine based on scraps of rumors about southern heretics. Last night, men in gray cloaks came to him, the office of the Word. A blow to the back of the head, a broken press. Edwin died on that floor, and Daniel woke up. A bluish line flashes before his eyes, translucent, like a scratch in the air. The Enlightener's system is activated. Skill, printing, rank E. He reads it 3 times, rubs his eyes. The line doesn't disappear. Fine, he's gone mad or died. But the tree is real. The blood is real. And he knows how to fix this better than anyone in either world. There's a knock at the door, quiet, timid. That's not how the office knocks. He gets up, walks over, opens the door. On the threshold stands a boy of about 13, skinny, dirty, with eyes red from crying. His name is Toby, Master Edwin's apprentice. He saw the light in the window, thought the master was dead. His sister sent him to check because she's afraid herself. Daniel lets him in. Toby sees the blood and recoils. Daniel says he was attacked but survived.
And that's when the real danger begins.
The boy looks at him strangely. Daniel doesn't speak like Edwin. He doesn't move like him. His memory suggests the words, but the intonation is unfamiliar. He blames it all on a blow to the head. Toby nods. He doesn't believe it, but he nods. Daniel looks around the workshop with eyes seeing it for the first time, though Edwin's memory knows every corner here. 2 tables, an awl, knives, bone flour glue, and 4 books on the shelves. In a world where a single book costs 200 gold pieces, that's a fortune. He sits down by the wreckage. The frame is cracked. The screw is bent. The board is split in 2. The gray cloaks did their job thoroughly, but they didn't know what they were breaking. They thought they were destroying heresy, but they broke a crude copy of what Daniel will assemble in a day. Because Edwin was feeling his way, and Daniel knows the blueprint. A diagram unfolds in the air, layer by layer, just like on a screen. The frame, the screw, the carriage, tolerances for every part. The clamp must fit perfectly flat, otherwise the impression will come out crooked, and every sheet is worth a day's wages.
Defects are unacceptable.
Toby watches as the master runs his finger through the air and clearly thinks he's lost his mind. Daniel asks about a wine press. Toby says there is one, in the basement. About the oak planks. There are scraps. About the lead. Toby hesitates. Then he says the master hid a bar of lead under a floorboard. 4 pounds, bought from smugglers. Daniel nods. 4 pounds is 200 liters. A full alphabet with room to spare. enough for a page. He says he's fixing the machine, that Toby mustn't tell a soul, especially the graycoats. The boy stares for a long time. Then he says that Master Edwin said the same thing, and that he didn't tell anyone then and won't tell anyone now. Something tightens inside Daniel. This boy keeps a dead man's secret, and is ready to keep the secret of the one who took his place. They start working at dawn. Daniel pulls the wine press out of the cellar. He takes it apart in an hour. The screw presses down on the plate presses against the mold leaves an impression. All book printing hinges on 3 words: pressure, contact, imprint. Toby silently hands him the tools and flinches when the master does something wrong. Edwin was right-handed. Daniel is left-handed. A trifle, but the boy notices. Daniel catches his gaze and forces himself to work with his right hand. Worse, but safer. By noon, the frame is ready. Oak scraps are fastened with iron staples. He checks the level with a bowl of water, an old trick. If the water doesn't run to the edge, the surface is even. Toby's mouth drops open. He says he's never seen anything like it. Daniel replies that his father taught him. It's actually true. His father in Portland checked his restorations exactly the same way. By evening, the press is half assembled. The plate and the pads are missing. Toby runs off for some leather and returns with a piece of sheepskin and a bundle of horsehair. The saddler next door doesn't ask why. In a world where people have their tongues cut out for curiosity, you quickly learn to keep quiet. Day 2. The hardest part. The type. A press without type is just a grape crusher. The letters decide everything. He pulls a bar of lead from under the floorboard. 4 pounds of lead. In the old world, a couple of dollars. Here, a carpenter's monthly wage. For perfect type, you need an alloy: lead, tin, antimony. There's no tin or antimony. Pure lead is soft. The mold will hold up for 300 impressions instead of 1,000. But 300 impressions is 300 pages, and that's already something. He molds a crucible from a pot. He builds a fire. There's no thermometer, but the system tells him the heat. He senses the metal like a musician senses a wrong note. The lead flows after 20 minutes. Silver in clay. There's no steel of the right hardness, so he cuts the matrix right into the soapstone that Toby found on the shore. The stone yields like butter. He carves the first letter, mirrored, pours in the lead, waits, strikes out the letter. A small lead column with a letter on the end. Rough. The craftsman from Portland would have given it a D, but it's the first printed letter in this world. By the end of the day, there are 40 of them. Fingers are burned and cut. The system is silent. The type is set to E. No sparks. And there won't be any until someone reads the proof. Day 3. He gathers everything: frame, screw, carriage, plate, pads. 40 letters in the typesetting. The ink is the hardest part. Soot from the chimney and half a bottle of linseed oil. He grinds them in a mortar into a thick black paste. Rolls the ink pad over the letters. They gleam black. He places a sheet of coarse, yellowish rag paper. Not parchment for 10 gold pieces. Ordinary paper. But it'll do. He pushes the carriage, grabs the handle, turns it. The plate goes down. Pressure. Contact. The impression. 1 second. 2. 3. He lifts the plate, pulls out the carriage, takes the sheet. A single line is printed in black on the rough paper. A prayer that every child in this world knows. One that Toby has heard in church 1,000 times. But he has never seen it written down. Because Toby cannot read. Daniel hands the sheet to the boy. Toby takes it. He looks at the black marks. He moves his lips. His finger crawls along the line. It stops on the first word, the first syllable, the second, the whole word. And he freezes. He has read it. The first word of his life. He didn't hear it from the priest. He didn't repeat it after the older ones. He read it himself from the sheet. His eyes well up. He doesn't understand why. He just stands in the dimly lit workshop with the sheet in his hands, tears streaming down his face, and he doesn't even wipe them away because he's still reading. A line flashes before Daniel's eyes. One more spark of enlightenment. There were 47,813 literate people in the kingdom. Now there were 47,814. He looks at the crying boy with the sheet of paper, and for the first time since waking up on the cold floor, he feels that he is exactly where he belongs. The morning of the fourth day began with a knock on the door. Not a timid one like Toby's, a confident one, a demanding one. Daniel froze at the workbench. He looked at Toby. The boy turned pale and pressed the sheet of paper with the prayer, which he hadn't let go of for a day, to his chest. Daniel quietly told him to hide the sheet and not show it to anyone. Toby tucked the paper into his shirt. The knock repeated. Daniel covered the workbench with a mat. He pushed the typesetting table with the letters under the desk. He walked to the door. He opened it. Standing on the threshold was a girl of about 19. A thin face, dark hair tied in a bun, hands covered in small scars from an awl and a knife. Mary Hawthorne, the senior apprentice, and formerly the sister of the man whose body Daniel now inhabited. Mary stared at him without blinking. Then she said she had come to pick up the orders. 4 books on the shelf were waiting to be bound, and the customer had already inquired twice. Daniel stepped back and let her in. Mary entered. She stopped. She sniffed the air. The workshop smelled different than usual. Linseed oil, soot, and just a hint of lead. She said nothing. She walked over to the bookshelf and began examining them, professionally, quickly. Her fingers checked the spines, the tension of the threads, the condition of the leather. Mary was a bookbinder born of God. She couldn't read a single word in the books she assembled with her own hands, but her stitching was flawless. Daniel watched her and thought about how things worked in this world. A woman assembles a book, stitches the pages together, covers it in leather, attaches the clasps, polishes the edges, and has no right to read a single letter inside. Literacy among women in Valdren is less than 1%, and that's considered normal. Mary finished. She turned to him. She said the order was ready for pickup and asked if she should take it to the customer today. Daniel said yes. Then he added that he wanted to talk to her when she got back. Mary looked at him for a long time. There was something in her eyes that made Daniel feel a chill. She knew. Not exactly what, but she sensed that the man standing before her wasn't who he claimed to be. 20 years by her brother's side. She knew his every gesture, every habit, how he tilted his head when listening, how he rubbed his thumb when nervous, how he squinted in the light. Daniel wasn't doing any of that. Mary took the books and left. Then Bibi exhaled, said Mary was scarier than the office. Daniel couldn't argue with that. He returned to the lathe, removed the mat, looked at the pressure plate, and thought about what he needed next. One prayer on a single sheet is a demonstration, not a product. He needed an alphabet book, 20 pages. The alphabet, simple words, pictures. No, not pictures. He didn't know how to engrave, only text. So the alphabet book would be text-based. A letter, a word with that letter, a short sentence, the next letter. He sat down at the table and began to lay out the design. In his mind, the system unfolded the blueprint. Not a machine this time, but a page layout. Margins, line spacing, letter size, number of lines per page. He saw it as a transparent grid superimposed on the sheet. 20 lines per page, 40 characters per line. That made 800 characters per page. 20 pages, 16,000 characters. Enough for a primer. But 40 letters isn't enough. To typeset a single page, you need all the letters at once, plus duplicates. At least 150 letters per page. And he can't typeset 20 pages at once, so he'll have to typeset them one by one. Print a run of that page, take it apart, typeset the next one. It's slow, monstrously slow. But there are no other options. Daniel did the math. 100 copies of the primer, 20 pages each. That's 2,000 prints. One print per minute, not counting typesetting time. 33 hours of pure printing, plus typesetting. About 2 hours per page for one person. 40 hours of typesetting. A total of 73 hours of work. 10 working days if working from dawn to dusk.
He could finish in 2 weeks, factoring in drying time and unforeseen delays. 2 weeks until the first print run. If they didn't find him first. He turned to Toby and asked what the boy knew about the men in gray cloaks who had come to see Edwin. Toby told him. There were 3 of them. They came at night. Not through the door, through a window on the 2nd floor. Toby had heard the noise from his little room in the basement, but was afraid to go upstairs. In the morning, he found the master on the floor. The machine was smashed, and a note on the table. The note had one word. Toby couldn't read it, but remembered what the letters looked like and scratched them with charcoal on the wall. Daniel looked at the wall. The clumsy charcoal letters formed a word. Be quiet. The office of the word didn't stand on ceremony, but it hadn't killed Toby and Mary either. That meant they believed the apprentices didn't know anything dangerous. That meant Daniel had time. How much, he didn't know, but clearly not forever. He told Toby they needed more lead and more paper, and that he needed to know who in Halmgard sold metal without asking questions. Toby thought for a moment. Then he said he knew one person, a blacksmith named Graham on the outskirts of the port. He repairs anchors and chains for fishing schooners. He takes payment in fish and doesn't ask what it's for. Daniel nodded. Then he asked about paper. Toby said there was only one workshop in town that made paper, on the waterfront. Expensive. For ship documents and trade contracts. Sheet paper comes in by ship from the south, but the last ship was a month ago. That was a problem. Without paper, the press is useless. Parchment cost a fortune, and you can't print on fabric. The ink would run. Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose. A word popped into his head. Rag paper. The cheapest kind of paper in the history of his world. Linen rags are boiled in lye, broken down into a fibrous pulp, poured onto a sieve, dried, pressed. Done. The raw material for rag paper was literally lying underfoot. Old sails, tattered shirts, sacks, ropes, flax, and hemp. All of this could be turned into paper. He asked Toby where in the city he could find old rags. Toby looked at him like he was crazy. Then he said there were mountains of rags in the port district. They burn them because there's nowhere to put them. Daniel smiled, for the first time in 4 days. He said they wouldn't burn anymore. Mary returned around noon. She brought the money for the order, 3 silver coins. Daniel took them and fell into thought. He needed the money. For lead, for tools, for food for himself and his 2 apprentices. Bookbinding brought in income, but it was slow and unstable, and he couldn't afford to draw attention with large orders. Mary placed the coins on the table and remained standing. She didn't leave. She looked at him. Then she said she wanted to know what kind of machine was under the mat. Daniel froze. Mary said she wasn't blind, that the workshop smelled of lead, that there were marks from hot metal on the floor, that Toby ran around town collecting strange things, and that the man standing before her wasn't her brother. Silence. Toby cowered in the corner. Daniel stood motionless. Mary looked at him and waited. He could have lied, could have said it was just a new tool for bookbinding, could have brushed it off. But he saw her hands,
hands that had spent 20 years collecting books she couldn't read. And he made a decision. He walked over to the machine. He removed the cover.
Mary saw the press, the typesetting machine, the sheet with the prayer drying on a string. She didn't understand. She asked what it was. Daniel took a blank sheet. He placed it on the carriage. He applied ink to the type. He pushed the carriage. He turned the screw. He pulled out the sheet. He handed it to her. Mary took the sheet. She looked at the black marks. To her, they were just blots. She couldn't read. She didn't understand what she was holding in her hands. Daniel said they were letters, that this machine made letters. So many letters, so fast, all the same, that in a single day this machine could produce as many pages as a scribe could in a year. Mary turned pale. Then she blushed. Then she turned pale again. She understood. Maybe not the whole picture, but enough. She understood that this machine was worth 500 gold pieces, not because that's how much they'd pay for it, but because a bounty had been placed on the head of the one who made it. She looked at Daniel. She said he wasn't Edwin. Not a question, a statement. Daniel said no, not Edwin. Mary asked where her brother was. Daniel said Edwin was dead, that the men in gray cloaks had killed him, that he himself didn't know how he'd ended up here, but that he knew how this machine worked, and that he knew what it was for. Mary was silent for a long time. Then she walked over to the rope where the sheet with the prayer was drying. She took it down. She looked at the letters. She ran her finger along the line. To her, they were just black symbols. Daniel quietly read aloud what was written on the sheet. Mary listened. She knew this prayer, knew it by heart. And now she stood there looking at the sheet, listening to the familiar words, and trying to figure out which symbols corresponded to which sounds. Daniel watched her eyes move, from left to right, down the line. She was trying to read, without a teacher, without a primer, just by ear and by sight. He said he would teach her if she wanted. Mary looked up at him. There was so much in her eyes that Daniel couldn't describe even if he tried. Fear, hope, anger, shame, and somewhere deep down, something like hunger. She said one word. Yes. That evening, Daniel sat down to a new task. He took a piece of paper and drew the first letter on it. Next to the letter, he drew an awl, a bit crooked but recognizable. Mary looked at it and said it was an awl. Daniel said correctly. This letter is the first sound in the word awl. It sounds like this. Mary repeated it. Then she looked at the letter, then at the awl, then at the letter again. And Daniel saw something click in her mind. Sound, symbol, object. Three things became one. He didn't make a universal primer. He made a primer for Mary. Each letter was illustrated with a bookbinder's tool: awl, thread, leather, knife, needle, press, glue, board, spine, clasp. Her world, her language, her hands. He wove the letters into the world she already knew, and that world began to speak to her in a new voice. The spark hadn't ignited yet. Mary couldn't read yet. She knew 3 letters. That wasn't enough. But Daniel saw her sitting by candlelight, running her finger over the paper and moving her lips, and he knew that the spark was only a matter of time. The next 10 days merged into a continuous rhythm, typing, printing, proofreading, typing again. Daniel worked 14 hours a day. His fingers got used to the lead. Calluses formed in the right places. Toby turned out to be a quick learner. The boy picked things up on the fly. By the 5th day, he could already set simple lines on the typesetting machine himself if Daniel showed him which letters to take. Toby couldn't read in the full sense of the word. He recognized letters. He could put together a familiar word, but long sentences still eluded him.
Instead, he memorized the arrangement of letters and the typecase the way one memorizes musical notes, by position rather than by meaning. Mary came every evening. She sat in the corner. She took out her sheet of paper. She learned a new letter, sometimes two. She memorized slowly, painfully slowly. Each letter came to her like a stone pulled from the ground. But she didn't miss a single evening. Daniel saw her sitting by candlelight, moving her lips silently, and something fierce burning in her eyes. She wasn't just learning letters. She was reclaiming from the world what the world had hidden from her for 20 years. On the 6th day of working on the primer, Daniel ran into the problem he'd been expecting. He was running out of paper. 6 sheets remained. That was enough for 6 prints. And he needed 2,000. He sent Toby to the port for rags. The boy returned with a sack of old sails and worn-out shirts. Daniel hauled a barrel up from the cellar. He filled it with water. He cut the rags into small pieces. He dumped them into the barrel. He added wood ash. Ash contains lye. Lye breaks down the binding agents in the fabric. The fibers soften. They disintegrate. They turn into mush. After 3 days of soaking, he pulled out the rag mass and began beating it with a wooden mallet on a stone slab. An hour. 2. 3. The fibers split apart. The mass became uniform. Toby helped. They took turns every half hour because their hands went numb from the blows. Then Daniel diluted the mass with water in a wide trough. The result was a murky, whitish slurry. He took the frame from an old sieve, covered it with a thin cloth, and scooped up the slurry. He raised the frame horizontally. The water drained off. A thin layer of fibrous pulp remained on the cloth. He turned the frame over onto a smooth board. He carefully removed the cloth. A wet sheet remained on the board, thin, uneven, but it was paper. The first sheet of paper made in Halmgard. Toby touched it with his finger and said it felt like a wet rag. Daniel replied that in a day it would look like a page. They made 20 sheets by evening. They placed them under the press. Daniel used the same machine for pressing. A screw pressed down on the stack of wet sheets, squeezing out the water. By morning the sheets had dried. Daniel removed them from the press and examined them. Rough, a bit thick. The surface was loose. Ink would bleed on paper like this if it wasn't sized. He needed glue. Animal glue made from bones or hide. Or starch. He chose starch. He sent Toby to get flour, the cheapest kind. He mixed the flour with water. He cooked up a liquid paste. He dipped each sheet. He dried them again. The surface became denser, smoother. He printed a test print. The ink took. Not perfectly. The letters bled slightly at the edges, but the text was legible, good enough for the first print run. Mary watched the paper-making process in silence. Then she said one thing that made Daniel stop. She said that rags were free at the port, that paper from the South cost half a silver coin per sheet, and that if he could make paper from rags, he could sell it for a quarter of a silver coin and still make a profit. Daniel looked at her. Mary looked at him calmly. She couldn't read, but she could count, and she had just come up with what, in his world, was called a business plan. He said she was right. But first, the books, then the business. Mary disagreed. She said that without money, there would be no books, no workshop, and no him. That the chancellery was looking for him, that there was a 500 gold bounty on his head, and that if he wanted to survive long enough to print his primers, he needed money for protection, for bribes to the port guards, for rent on a safe place, for food. She was right. Annoyingly right. Daniel was used to thinking of books as the goal. Mary thought of books as a process, and a process requires resources. He agreed. They agreed that some of the paper would be sold, quietly, through trusted dealers. Mary knew 3. People who bought bookbinding work from Edwin and asked no questions. On the 9th day, what Daniel had feared happened. A man from the office arrived at the port of Hull. A man from the chancellery arrived. Not a gray cloak. Worse, an assistant to the inquisitor. A young priest in a black cassock with a silver book on a chain. He questioned the merchants at the market. He showed them a drawing. Daniel didn't see the sketch, but Toby did. The boy ran into the workshop, white as a sheet. He said the sketch showed a wooden frame with a screw. Not a machine, not a press. Just a frame with a screw. The chancellery didn't know what the whole machine looked like. They only knew what they'd seen when they broke apart Edwin's press. A frame. That was both bad and good at the same time. Bad because they were looking for it. Good because they didn't know what to look for. Daniel made a quick decision. The machine had to be moved. Edwin's workshop was known to the office. They had come here once, they would come again. He asked Toby if there was a place in the city that no one checked. Toby thought for a moment. Then he said that at the old shipyard behind the south wall there were abandoned warehouses. They used to store lumber for ships there. Now rats and vagrants live there. The guards didn't go in there. The chancellery certainly didn't. They moved the machine at night. Daniel took it apart. The frame, the screw, the carriage, the plate. He wrapped the typesetting machine with the letters in a rag and carried it himself. Every letter was worth its weight in gold, literally. Toby carried the paper and ink. Mary walked ahead and checked the alleys. 3 shadows in the night city. They reached the shipyard in an hour. The basement of the old warehouse turned out to be dry. Stone walls, earthen floor. 2 windows near the ceiling boarded up. Perfect. Daniel reassembled the press in 3 hours. By dawn, he was already printing. They hadn't abandoned Edwin's workshop. Mary continued to go there during the day and work on bookbinding orders. It was a cover. If anyone asked where Master Edwin was, Mary would say her brother had gone to stay with relatives in the village to heal his wounds after the attack. Plausible, enough to buy time. Daniel sat in the shipyard basement and printed, page after page. The primer was taking shape. 20 pages, every letter, every word chosen so that a child from the port would recognize it. Fish, boat, net, sail, anchor, rope, stone, rain, bread, water. Familiar words. The world around the child, written down in letters. He didn't want to teach them words they didn't know. He wanted to show that the words they already knew could be written down, that their world was worthy of letters. On the 12th day, the first primer was ready. 20 pages, a cover made of rough cardboard. Mary had sewn the notebook herself. The stitching was perfect. Daniel took the finished book in his hands. Small, it fit in the palm of his hand. 20 pages of rough paper with black letters. The ugliest book in the world, and the most important. He pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them and began printing copies. 100 copies. Toby set the type. Daniel printed. Mary bound the notebooks. 3 people, 1 press, 1 candle in the basement of an abandoned shipyard. In 4 days, they made 60 copies. Then the lead ran out. The type wore out. Some of the letters had worn down to the point of illegibility. Daniel looked at the worn-out letter and cursed under his breath. Pure lead. Too soft. 1,000 prints turned into 300. Just as he had calculated. He needed an alloy. Lead, tin, antimony. But where to find tin and antimony in a port city of the late medieval world? He sent Toby to the blacksmith, Graham. The boy returned with news. There was tin. At the tinker's stall in the market. Expensive, but there was some. No antimony. No one in the city even knew the word. Daniel fell. Another word came to Edwin's mind. Stibium, the local name for antimony. Apothecaries used it for some kind of ointment. He sent Toby to the apothecary. The boy returned with a small bag of gray powder, stibium, 10 grams. It cost as much as a meal for 3. But that was enough. Daniel remelted the leftover lead, added tin and antimony, a new alloy. The letters cast from it were harder, sharper. The edges of the letters were straight, not blurred. He made a test print and saw the difference. The letters were sharp, beautiful. Every stroke was in place. He smiled. Then he cast a new set of letters, 180 of them. A full alphabet with a triple supply of the most common letters. The work went faster. By this time, Mary knew 14 letters. She couldn't read sentences yet, but she could read her name. Daniel had printed it separately on a small piece of paper, 4 letters. Mary. She held that piece of paper as if it were the greatest treasure in the world.
She hid it in the pocket of her apron. Sometimes she took it out and looked at it. She just looked at the 4 letters that were her. That meant her. Not Edwin's sister. Not apprentice. Not the girl from the bindery. Mary. On the 16th day, the print run was ready. 100 copies of the primer. A stack of small notebooks bound with twine. Daniel stood before them and thought of Gutenberg. The first print run of Gutenberg's Bible consisted of 180 copies. It took him 2 years. Daniel had printed 100 primers in 6, of poorer quality, with rougher paper, simpler in content. But the principle was the same. A multitude of identical copies, knowledge multiplied by number. Now he had to distribute this knowledge, and this is where the most dangerous part began. Distributing primers in broad daylight would be suicide. Daniel understood this. The office was looking for a car. The Inquisitor's assistant was still walking around the port, and although he hadn't found anything yet besides rumors spread quickly in a small town, another method was needed. Toby suggested an idea. The boy knew the port like the back of his hand. Every alleyway, every crevice between the warehouses, every nook where the harbor children hid. There were many of them. Orphans, half-orphans, children of fishermen who had gone to sea and never returned, children of dock workers, cripples, beggars, thieves. They lived in packs, shared bread and shelter, and not a single one of them could read. Toby said he could distribute primers through them, little books, small enough to fit in a pocket. The guards don't search children. No one searches children. They are invisible. Daniel agreed, but he set a condition. Simply handing out books is pointless. The children can't read. They'll look at the letters and use the pages to start a fire. We need a teacher. Someone has to show them the first letters, explain the principle. Just once. That's enough. If a child understands that a squiggle on paper represents a sound he utters every day, he'll figure the rest out on his own. Toby volunteered. He didn't know the whole alphabet, but he knew most of it. Daniel taught him in the evenings after work. The boy picked it up quickly. Within a week, he could read short sentences from the primer, slowly and stumbling, but he could do it. Daniel sent him to the port with 10 copies. Toby left in the morning. He returned in the evening, without the books, with eyes ablaze. He told how he'd found a group of 7 children in the basement of an old warehouse, how he'd given each one a primer, how he'd sat down on the floor with them and shown them the first 3 letters, how one boy, about 10 years old, took a book and wouldn't let it go even while he ate, how a girl, about 8 years old, started crying when she realized that the symbol on the page was the first sound of her name. A line lit up before Daniel's eyes, plus 3 sparks of enlightenment. 3 of the 7 children had already begun putting letters together into syllables. 4 hadn't yet, but the foundation had been laid. The number of literate people in the kingdom rose to 47,817. He sent Toby back the next day, and the day after that. The boy handed out 5 books at a time. He found new groups of children. He showed them the letters. He left.
He returned 3 days later to check on them. Some children were already reading. Others had lost their books or torn them up. Still others had traded them for food.
That was normal. Daniel knew that out of 100 copies, maybe 30 would reach their destination, maybe 20. Even 20 literate people are 20 sparks. By the end of the 3rd week after distribution began, the counter showed 16 new sparks. 47,830 literate people. Slowly, very slowly, but it was working. On the 22nd day, Lily arrived. She didn't come to D'Angel, she came to Toby. She found him at the port when he was handing out books. She stood in front of him and said she wanted one too. Toby gave her a primer. Lily sat right down on the gangplank. She opened the first page. And in 2 hours, she read the whole thing, all 20 pages. Toby decided she already knew how to read and was just pretending, but no, Lily had never seen letters before. She simply looked at the first page, where a familiar word stood next to a letter, and within seconds, she understood the principle. A letter is a sound. A word is a sequence of sounds. A sentence is a sequence of words. That's it. She grasped it the way other people grasp a hot coal, instantly and completely. Toby led her to the shipyard basement. Lily went inside. She looked around. She saw the machine. She walked over. She touched the frame. She touched the type. She looked at Daniel. She was 14, dirty, skinny, barefoot. Her hair was tangled in knots, a torn shirt down to her knees. And her eyes. Her eyes were like 2 black lakes reflecting a fire. She asked how many books like that he could make in a day. Daniel said 10. Lily said that wasn't enough. Daniel looked at her, a 14-year-old beggar girl who 2 hours ago had seen letters for the first time in her life, was standing in front of him, criticizing his productivity. He asked how many she thought he needed to make. Lily thought for a moment. She calculated something in her head. Then she said that about 12,000 people live in Halmgard. Of those, about 3,000 are children. Of the children, maybe 100 are literate. The remaining 2,900 are not. If he wants to teach them all, he needs 3,000 primers. At 10 a day, that's 300 days, almost a year. And the Chancellery won't wait a year. Daniel looked at her silently. Then he asked how she knew how many people lived in Halmgard. Lily shrugged. She said she'd counted at home, and the people in the houses, and the ships in the harbor, and the fish at the market. She counted everything. Always. Because numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers don't. Daniel turned to Toby. Toby spread his hands. Daniel turned back to Lily. He said she could stay if she wanted to work. Lily said she did, and that she was hungry, and that if he fed her, she'd show him where in the port he could get tin cheaper than from the tinker at the market. He fed her. She showed him. The tin really was cheaper, by 1/3. Lily knew the port like a body knows its own blood. Every merchant, every price, every smuggler's route. She didn't just survive on the streets, she cataloged the streets. She built a mental map of goods, prices, people, and connections. And now that map was working for Daniel. Over the next week, Lily did 3 things. First, she found a source of cheap rags. A laundry on the waterfront was throwing out damaged linens. They used to burn them. Lily arranged to take them for free in exchange for taking out the trash in the mornings. Second, she compiled a list of all the children's groups in the port, 14 packs, from 3 to 20 people in each. The leaders' names, where they slept, their movement schedules. Third, she devised a distribution system. Don't hand out primers to just anyone. Give them only to those who've already learned 5 letters. Let the rest learn from those who received them. 1 primer for every 5 children. The book became a reward rather than a gift. Daniel listened to her and caught himself feeling something strange. This girl was doing what in his world was called a marketing strategy, a distribution funnel, audience segmentation,
creating demand through scarcity. She's 14. She's barefoot. And she's smarter than half of his colleagues from Portland. The sparks spread faster. Lily's distribution system was working. The children were learning to read, teaching each other. They passed the primers from hand to hand. A month after distribution began, the counter showed 74 new sparks, 47,888 literate people. The literacy rate in Halmgard rose from 3 to 3.5%, unnoticed by the world. But Daniel saw.
He saw the boy at the pier tracing his finger over the tavern sign and whispering as he put the letters together into words. He saw the girl sitting on a barrel, reading the price tag on a basket of fish and counting her change. He saw an old beggar to whom his grandson had shown a primer, and the old man sat motionless for an hour trying to read the first line, his hands trembling. It was working. Slowly, quietly, but unstoppably. And then the chancellery struck. Not at Daniel, at the children. An assistant inquisitor found a primer, one of 100, on a boy of about 10 who had been caught stealing an apple. During a search of his shirt, they found a small notebook with letters. The priest looked at it. He flipped through the pages. He turned pale. And he sent a messenger, not to the city guard, to the capital. Daniel found out about it from Mary. She'd heard it at the market. The vendors were whispering. The boy from the port was taken away by men in gray cloaks. They found a devilish book on him, a small one, with letters, the kind no one had ever seen before, because the letters in it weren't handwritten. They were all identical. All the A's looked the same. All the B's looked the same, as if they had been stamped, not written by hand, as if a machine had made them. Daniel listened to this and sat down on the basement floor. He put his hands on his knees. He closed his eyes. The Inquisitor's assistant had sent a messenger to the capital. This meant that in 2 weeks, 3 at most, someone from the higher-ups would arrive in Halmgard. Someone who knew what they were looking for. Someone who wouldn't be questioning the market vendors, but would start interrogating the children. A boy from the port, 10 years old, caught with a primer. Daniel asked Lily if she knew this boy. Lily said yes. His name is Ren. He's from the pack that sleeps under the bridge. Quiet, not very smart, but diligent. He learned the entire alphabet in 2 weeks and was very proud of his primer. Daniel asked if Ren knew where the primer came from. Lily shook her head. Ren thought the books fell from the sky. Toby distributed them through intermediaries. None of the children knew where the workshop was or who printed the primers. It was Lily's idea. A chain of intermediaries. Each link knew only the one next to it. She was 14 years old and had invented a cellular structure for the underground network. Daniel felt both pride and horror. Pride in the girl who thought like a strategist. Horror at a world in which 14-year-old children had to think like strategists to survive, with a book tucked on. He asked what would happen to Ren. Mary said quietly, "If he is found to be literate, they will brand his forehead, the letters Z and B. Thirst for letters. And he would bear that brand for the rest of his life." Daniel clenched his fists. He looked at the stack of primers on the table, at the machine, at the type in the typesetting machine, at Toby, who was looking at him with a silent question in his eyes, at Lily, who stood in the corner, motionless, at Mary, who had lowered her eyes and was silent. He could have stopped, taken the press apart, buried the type, destroyed the remaining primers, pretended nothing had happened. And the 10-year-old boy would be branded on the forehead, and he would go on living with a clean forehead. He stood up, said they needed to print another 100 copies. Mary raised her head. In her eyes was something similar to what he'd seen when she first read her name. Toby nodded and went to get the lead. For the next 2 weeks, Daniel worked harder than ever in both of his lives. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate what Mary brought him. He printed.
The letters clattered on the typesetting machine. The screw creaked. The ink settled on the paper. 100 copies became 200. 200 became 300. Lily rebuilt the distribution network. She eliminated direct contacts. Now the primers reached the children through 3 intermediaries. A fisherman would hand a bundle to a boy on the pier. The boy would carry it to a woman at the well. The woman would pass it to an old woman who sold nuts in the square. The old woman would hand them out to the children one by one, disguised as wrapping paper. No one knew where the books came from. No one knew where they were going. The system worked. Sparks were flying. 47,912, 47,941, 47,963. Each number is a child who put letters together to form a word,
who looked at the page and heard their own voice in the black marks. Daniel watched the counter. Rank E required 300 sparks for promotion. He had 150, halfway there. At the same time, he was doing other things. The paper workshop had started up on its own. Mary found 2 women from the laundry who agreed to help in exchange for food and small change. They didn't know why the paper was needed. They thought it was for Master Edwin's bookbinding business. They soaked the rags in barrels. They pounded them with hammers. They strained it through sieves, dried it, sized it. 20 sheets a day, then 30, then 40. Some went toward primers. Some Mary sold through merchants. The paper was coarse but cheap, half the price of imported paper. The merchants bought it, for wrappers, for notes, for bills. Money came in. Not much, but enough to buy food for 4, lead for letters, and oil for paint. On the 3rd day of the 2nd week, Mary read the first sentence all the way through. She was sitting in the basement by candlelight. She ran her finger along the line. She moved her lips. And suddenly she stopped. She looked up. She looked at Daniel. And she said 5 words aloud. They were simple words. A thread passes through the leather. A sentence from the primer, from the very one he had made for her with a bookbinder's tools. A thread passes through the leather. Mary read it 10 times, 20, 30. The same 5 words every time, as if she were tasting them, as if she didn't believe it. A line flashed before Daniel's eyes. +1 spark. Mary had become literate. Not completely, not fluently. But the system deemed that she had crossed the threshold. She could read simple text, slowly, with mistakes. But she could. Daniel said nothing. He simply placed a new sheet in front of her, with a new sentence, a longer one. Mary looked at him, looked at the sheet, and began to read again. Meanwhile, Lily did something Daniel hadn't expected. She drew a map, a real map of Halmgard. She sketched it in charcoal on a piece of paper, roughly but accurately. Streets, alleys, squares, houses. And on this map, she marked with dots every place where primers were being distributed. Every group, every intermediary, every route. Daniel looked at the map and saw a city that was learning to read. The dots were concentrated in the port, at the market, in the fishing district. The wealthy part of the city was empty. People who already knew how to read lived there, or who didn't care. Lily said they needed to expand. The port is covered. The children in the port either already have primers or know about them. We need the artisan quarters, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, weavers. Their children aren't learning either. But their children don't live in packs. They live at home with their parents. And the parents fear the chancellery. That was a different task. The harbor children were invisible. They have nothing to lose. But a craftsman's child is a child with a father and a mother and a home and a name. If he is caught with a primer, the consequences will fall on the whole family. Daniel thought about this for 3 days. Then he found a solution, not through the children, through the mothers. He printed a new book, not a primer, a herbarium, 12 pages, 20 herbs.
There were no illustrations, only names, descriptions, methods of use. Chamomile for stomach aches, wormwood for fever, mint for nausea. Knowledge that every midwife carried in her head, but in their heads it got mixed up, forgotten, distorted.
On paper, they stood forever. Daniel printed 30 copies of the herb book and passed them on through Mary. Mary knew the midwives. 3 women in town who delivered babies and treated childhood illnesses. They couldn't read, but they wanted to be able to. Because a herbal guide is not heresy, it is health. It is a living child instead of a dead one. It is a mother who did not die from hemorrhage because the midwife gave her the right herb in time. The midwives took the herbal guides. They asked someone literate to read them aloud. They memorized them. Then they began to cross-check them with what they knew themselves. And they discovered that the herbalist was accurate. Daniel had compiled it from Edwin's memory and his own knowledge of medieval medicine. He didn't include anything he wasn't certain of. No mercury, no arsenic, only what worked. The midwives began to learn the alphabet, not for the sake of literacy, for the sake of the work, so they could read their own herbalists and not depend on the eyes of others. 3 midwives, 3 sparks in 2 weeks. But the main thing wasn't them. The main thing was what they told others, quietly, in a whisper. There's a little book, small, about herbs, accurate. And if you learn to read, you'll be able to use it yourself, without a husband, without a priest, without anyone's permission. The word yourself was key. In a world where a woman didn't even have the right to her own name on official documents, the word yourself sounded like thunder. Demand for the herbal guide exceeded supply within a week. 30 copies sold out instantly. Mary came and said they needed 50 more. Daniel started printing. And then, something happened that changed everything. A man no one was expecting came down to the shipyard basement. Daniel heard footsteps on the stairs. He grabbed a hammer, the only weapon in the workshop. Toby hid behind the lathe. Lily froze against the wall. A figure appeared in the doorway. A woman, short, fragile, in a dark, unadorned dress, her hood pulled down over her face. She stopped in the doorway. She pulled back her hood. A young face, pale skin, dark eyes, gloves on her hands. Even in the basement, even by candlelight, gloves. She looked around the basement, the printing press, type, stacks of primers, sheets of paper drying on strings. And she said one W word. She said she had come here because she had read his herbarium and found 3 errors in the names of the herbs, and that she wanted to correct them. Daniel slowly lowered his hammer. He asked who she was. She gave her name. Lady Seraphina Ashford, the youngest daughter of the House of Ashford, the only literate woman of high society in Holmgard. Daniel knew that name from Edwin's memory. The House of Ashford was impoverished but still noble. Seraphina was the only one in the family who could read. Her father had taught her in defiance of the law. Because he had no sons, and someone had to read the family documents. Seraphina said she had found the herbalist's book with her maid. The maid had received it from the midwife. Seraphina read it. She found errors. She traced the chain back to the source, and she came. Daniel asked how she had found the workshop. Seraphina replied that it had not been difficult. The midwife had told the maid. The maid told the cook. The cook knew a fisherwoman who had seen a boy with books on the pier. The boy was Toby. Toby could be tracked down. She tracked him down. 3 days of surveillance, and here she is. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. If Lady Seraphina could trace the chain in 3 days, then the Chancellery could do it in 2. Seraphina read it on his face. She said that was exactly why she was here, not because of the errors in the herbarium, but to warn him. The chain of distribution is full of holes. Too many chatty middlemen. Too many people know too much. And the Inquisitor's assistant isn't a fool.
She said she could help. She has connections, money, access to circles a dock boy and a beggar girl would never enter. She can arrange distribution through trading houses, officially, under the guise of wrapping paper, or educational materials for merchants' children. Daniel asked why. Why would she do that? Serafina paused. Then she removed the glove from her right hand. There were ink stains on the back of her hand. Old, set in. For 12 years she had been recording her observations of plants. Descriptions, drawings, classifications. 12 years in a drawer. Because a woman doesn't write books. A woman has no opinions worthy of paper. For 12 years her notes lay in a locked drawer, and no one in the world knew they existed. She said she wanted one thing.
Just one. She wanted her notes to be published, so that they exist not as a single copy in a locked drawer, but in many, so they couldn't be destroyed, burned, lost, or forgotten, so that 100 years from now someone would open this book and read it and learn that she existed, what she thought, what she saw. Daniel looked at her, at the ink stains on her hand, at the dark eyes in which there were no tears, only a cold, stubborn flame. He said yes. Serafina put on a glove, nodded, and left. 3 days later, she sent a package via a messenger. Inside the package were 200 sheets of thin paper, the finest paper Daniel had ever seen in this world. White, smooth, even. The paper cost a fortune. A note was attached to the paper, 4 words, for the herbalist, without errors, and a list of 3 corrections. Daniel corrected the errors in the typescript. He printed a new version of the herbarium on Serafina's paper, 50 copies. The letters on the white paper stood out clearly and beautifully, as if they were screaming. He set aside 10 copies. He gave the rest to Mary for distribution. He kept 10 for another matter. He began typing up Serafina's notes. Lady Serafina sent the manuscript a week later. A thick stack of sheets covered in small, neat handwriting. 12 years of work. Descriptions of 320 plants, with drawings in the margins. Daniel read and couldn't stop. It wasn't just a botany, it was a system. Serafina classified plants by habitat, by properties, by how they interacted with one another. She had identified patterns that no scientist in this world knew, because no scientist had spent 12 years observing the same garden, recording every change, every season, every year. He typeset the first 20 pages, cast special, smaller typefaces for the notes, printed a proof, sent it to Serafina. The reply came the next day, brief. She asked him to widen the margins for the reader's future annotations. Daniel smiled. She was thinking of the reader, about the person who would open her book and want to add their own observations alongside hers. She was thinking about a dialogue across the page, across time, across space. He widened the margins and continued typesetting. By the end of the month, Daniel had 4 projects on the go at once. The primer, 3rd edition. The herbarium, 2nd, revised edition. Serafina's Notes, Volume 1. And a new book, a calculation table for fishermen and merchants. Lily had suggested this idea. She said that port merchants cheat fishermen because fishermen don't know how to count. If fishermen were given a table with prices and weights, they would be able to check the calculations. This isn't literacy, it's money. And money is an argument even the chancellery can't argue with. Daniel typed up the table. 12 pages. Prices for the main types of fish by weight. A conversion table. Simple formulas for calculating profit. And on the last page, the alphabet. Just the alphabet. No explanations, no comments. Anyone who learned to use the spreadsheet would sooner or later look at the last page and ask a question. Those were quiet days.
hot and quiet. The workshop in the shipyard basement hummed. Toby typed away, humming under his breath. Lily counted print runs and planned routes. Mary bound notebooks with perfect stitches and read a new page from the primer every evening, slowly, syllable by syllable. But now, without stopping. Daniel stood at the machine and turned the screw. Pressure, contact, imprint. Again and again.
The 408th print today. 48,093 literate people in the kingdom. Rank E. 280 sparks out of 300. 20 sparks until promotion. 20 children. 20 elderly people. 20 women who, for the first time in their lives, will read their own names. He turned the screw, and the world around him changed. Quietly, imperceptibly, irreversibly. 20 sparks. Daniel sensed their approach as a sailor senses the shore beyond the horizon. Every day the counter moved. 48,102, 109, 115. Primers were distributed throughout the city. Herbalists slipped away through the midwives. Fishermen hid their tally sheets in their bosoms and pulled them out at the pier when the merchant named a price. Daniel saw how the port was changing. Little things, imperceptible to the untrained eye. A boy at the market reads the name on a sack of grain. A woman by the well runs her finger over the wrapper and puts the letters together. An old fisherman takes out a chart and recalculates the weight of the catch before handing it over to the middleman. And for the first time in 20 years, the middleman cannot cheat. Because the numbers on paper don't lie. Lily was right. Numbers don't lie. The 18th spark came from a woman Daniel had never seen. A midwife on the outskirts of town taught her daughter to read from a herb book. The daughter was 32 years old. She had given birth to 6 children, and for the first time in her life, read a word. The 19th came from the boy, Graham's blacksmith's apprentice. Graham himself brought the primer and grumbled that the boy was reading the signs and that it annoyed him. But the blacksmith's eyes weren't annoyed. They were proud. The 20th spark came at dawn. Daniel was standing at the machine typing up another page of Seraphina's notes when a blue flash flared before his eyes. Not a line, a flash, as if someone had struck the inside of his eyelids with lightning. Rank upgraded, E becomes D. New technologies available. He grabbed the edge of the table. A drawing unfolded before his eyes. Not that rough layer-by-layer sketch he'd seen before. A full-fledged engineering diagram. A metal typesetting case with guides. A spring-loaded clamp for the typesetting machine. An improved ink roller instead of a pad. And most importantly, a screw press with a lever-assisted mechanism. A design that doubled the pressure with the same screw rotation. This meant a sharper impression, a faster cycle, more pages per hour. He stood there looking at the blueprint, his hands trembling, not from fear, but with anticipation. This was a late 15th century press, not Gutenberg, post-Gutenberg, the Italian school, Aldus Manutius, the man who invented the pocketbook, italics, page numbering, table of contents. Daniel knew everything about Manutius. He'd written his dissertation on him. And now, Manutius's blueprints were unfolding before him in a bluish glow in the basement of an abandoned shipyard in a world where children were branded for using a primer. Toby noticed that the master was standing motionless, staring into space. He asked if everything was okay. Daniel turned to him. He said everything was fine. That everything was very fine. That they needed more iron. Much more iron. Toby didn't understand, but he nodded. He was used to the master saying strange things, and then those strange things turning into books. Daniel began building a new press that very day. The old wooden press remained in use. Toby and Lily printed primers on it. And Daniel, in the corner of the basement, assembled the new structure. An iron frame, not wooden. Iron is stronger.
It doesn't bend. It doesn't crack. It withstands pressure that would split an oak tree. He ordered 4 iron strips from Graham. Graham didn't ask why. He took payment in silver and fish. He forged them in 3 days. Daniel assembled the frame himself. Bolts, wedges, fitting. He checked every joint for clearance. The gap was no wider than a hair's breadth. Otherwise, the pressure would escape sideways and the impression would blur. He made the lever mechanism from a ship's block. Toby had brought it from a dismantled schooner at the shipyard. The block provided double leverage. A quarter turn of the handle pressed down on the plate with enough force to make the tabletop creak. The ink roller was a whole other story. In his former world, rollers were made from a gelatin and glycerin-based mixture. There was no glycerin here. Daniel used leather. He covered a wooden cylinder with sheepskin. He soaked it in linseed oil. The result was a roller that applied ink more evenly than a pad. Not perfect, but 3 times faster. A week later, the new press was ready. Daniel placed a sheet of Serafina's paper on the carriage. White, smooth. He applied the ink with the roller. The letters glistened with a smooth, even layer of black. He pushed the carriage forward, pulled the lever. The platen descended with a dull, metallic clang. He held it for 3 seconds, lifted it, pulled out the sheet, and froze. The impression was flawless. The letters stood out clearly. The edges were even, not a single smudge, not a single smear. Every stroke of every letter was imprinted as if carved with a knife. This was no amateurish print from a basement. This was a printed page, a real one. One you wouldn't be ashamed to next to a handwritten book worth 200 gold pieces. One wouldn't be ashamed to show this to the king. Toby walked over and looked at the sheet, then at the old press, then at the new one. He said quietly that the new one was better. Daniel replied that the new one was 4 times faster, 40 prints an hour instead of 10, 160 pages per workday instead of 40. Lily heard the numbers and her eyes lit up. She began counting aloud. 160 pages a day, 20 pages in a primer, 8 primers a day on the new press alone, plus the old press, plus 1 more if they built it. She looked at Daniel and said she needed more middlemen. Daniel nodded. Everything was picking up speed. Just at that moment, as he stood over the new press and looked at the flawless print, there was a knock at the basement door. A coded knock. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 knocks. It was Mary's code. She entered quickly. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. She said 1 word. "He's here." Daniel didn't ask who. He knew. The Inquisitor's assistant had sent a messenger 6 weeks ago. The messenger had ridden to the capital in 10 days. The reply was coming back by sea because the road through the mountains had been washed out by the rains. The ship arrived this morning. On board was a man in a black cassock. Not a young priest with a silver book on a chain. Another one. Older. Calmer. More terrifying. Father Cassian, Chief Inquisitor of the Office of the Word in the northern provinces. Mary told him what she knew. Cassian arrived with 4 assistants and a dozen guards. He took up residence in City Hall. He summoned the port mayor and the chief of the guard. He closed the doors. He conferred for 2 hours. Afterward, the guards took to the streets and began searching the port district. They were looking for wooden frames with screws. They were looking for lead letters. They were looking for small books with identical letters. Daniel listened. He looked at the machine, at the letters, at the stacks of primers. Everything he had built over 2 months could be lost in a single day. He turned to Lily. He asked how many primers were left in the warehouse. Lily answered, 83 copies, plus 30 herbals, plus 20 counting tables. Daniel made a decision. He said to give everything away, right now, today. Everything we have, down to the last copy. Lily didn't ask why. She understood. If the guards found the books in the workshop, it would be evidence. If the books were in people's hands all over the city, it was a fact. You can't confiscate a fact. She gathered the books into 3 bags. She called Toby. They divided up the routes. Lily to the south, Toby to the east,
Mary to the north through the market.
2 hours later, all the bags were empty. All the books had been distributed. 133 copies had vanished into the city like water into sand. Daniel was left alone in the basement, with the printing presses, with the type, with a supply of paper and ink. If the guards found the basement, they would find everything. You can't hide a printing press under your coat. He couldn't take it apart and carry it away, not in 2 hours, not alone. He sat down on the floor, closed his eyes, and thought about what he would do if they caught him. He had no weapons, no magic, no strong arms or fast legs. He was a bookbinder in a stranger's body with a D-rank skill in printing and nothing else. Then he opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked over to the table. He took a sheet of paper. He typeset a short text, printed it, let it dry, folded it in 4, put it in his pocket, and headed for the exit. He walked through the city in broad daylight, for the first time in 2 months, without a hood, without a disguise, wearing the work apron of master bookbinder Edwin Hawthorne. He was heading to City Hall, to Cassian, alone.
Mary saw him at the market and grabbed his sleeve. She asked where he was going. Daniel answered. Mary turned pale. She said that he was mad. Daniel said it was possible, but if Cassian found him before he got to Cassian, it would be an arrest. And if he went on his own, it would be a visit. The difference was huge. Mary wouldn't let go of his sleeve. Daniel gently removed her hand. He told her to go back to the workshop and keep working, no matter what happened. Mary watched him walk away. He could feel her gaze on his back all the way to the corner. Homgard Town Hall was a 2-story stone building. 2 guards stood at the door. Daniel approached. He said he was Master Bookbinder Edwin Hawthorne and requested an audience with Father Cassian regarding a matter pertaining to his craft. The guards exchanged glances. One went inside. He returned a minute later. He led Daniel down a stone corridor to a door at the end. He opened it. Daniel entered. The room was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a candle. A small notebook lay on the table, a primer. That very one, the one taken from the boy Wren. A man of about 50 sat at the table. Thin, short-cropped gray hair, a calm face. Eyes gray and attentive, like those of a man who had spent his whole life reading other people's faces and had learned to see more behind them than they wanted to show. A black cassock without adornments, no silver books on a chain, no pretentiousness. Father Cassian. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at him. Cassian pointed to a chair. Daniel sat down. Cassian picked up the primer from the table. He opened it to the first page. He placed it in front of Daniel and said he wanted to know who had done it. Daniel looked at the primer, at the letters he himself had typeset, printed, and bound. Then he looked at Cassian and said he had done it. Silence. Cassian didn't move. His expression didn't change. He just stared. Then he asked why. And Daniel took a sheet of paper folded in 4 out of his pocket. He unfolded it. He placed it on the table next to the primer. A text was printed on the sheet, a short one, an appeal to the Inquisitor of the Office of the Word, requesting clarification on exactly which provisions of the law on heresy are violated by the production of printed copies of prayer texts approved by the office. Because if the text is approved by the office, then its content cannot be heresy. And if the method of copying is heresy, then Daniel asks to be told in which specific treatise it is stated that copying by hand is permissible, but copying by machine is sinful.
And if such a treatise exists, may Daniel receive a copy of it, preferably a printed one because that is faster. Cassian read the letter. He read it again. He looked up at Daniel, and for the first time during the entire conversation, his expression changed. Barely noticeably, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was something very close to one. Cassian didn't arrest him. Daniel had expected that. He hadn't hoped for it, but he had expected it. Cassian wasn't the type to act before thinking. The Inquisitor offered him some wine. Daniel declined. Cassian poured himself a cup, toasted it, set the cup on the table, and began to speak. He spoke slowly, weighing every word. He said that Daniel's formal question was elegant, that from the standpoint of the letter of the law, he was right. The text of approved prayers cannot be heresy, regardless of the method of reproduction. No treatise prohibits machine copying, because no treatise foresaw its existence. The law is silent. And where the law is silent, there is no crime. Then Cassian said, "But." And that "but" was heavier than anything he had said before. He said that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are different things, that the office of the word does not exist to ban prayers. It exists to control knowledge. A literate peasant is not a crime. A literate peasant is a threat. Not because he is a bad person, but because he will start asking questions to which there are no good answers. Cassian gave an example. 120 years ago, in the southern duchy of Talvin, the peasants gained access to books. An itinerant preacher taught them to read and write. Within 3 years, a quarter of the province could read. 5 years later, they read the tax decrees and realized they were being cheated. 7 years later, they rose up in rebellion. 12,000 people took to the roads with pitchforks and axes. The Duke called in the army. 3 months of fighting. 20,000 dead. Villages were burned, fields were trampled. Famine, plague. Another 30,000 died of disease after the war. 50,000 dead for 3 years of literacy. Cassian looked at Daniel and asked if it had been worth it. Daniel was silent. He couldn't argue. Because Cassian wasn't lying. Edwin's memory confirmed it. There had been an uprising in Talvin. There were casualties. And the link between literacy and the uprising was direct. Cassian continued. He said he didn't consider literacy an evil. He considered it a weapon. And a weapon in the hands of those who don't know how to use it kills its owner more often than the enemy. A peasant who reads a tax decree will get angry, but he won't read the context. He won't learn that the tax has been raised because of the war in the north. He won't understand that if he doesn't pay, the orcs will be standing at his door in a year. He'll see the number and grab an axe. Because literacy without education is a match without a lantern. It shines brightly. It burns everything around it. Daniel listened, and he understood that sitting before him was the most dangerous enemy of all possible ones. Not a fool, not a fanatic, not a cruel sadist in a cassock. A smart, educated man who sincerely believed he was doing the right thing, and who had arguments, compelling arguments. Daniel spoke, quietly, slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said he understood Father Cassian's fears, that the uprising in Talvin was a tragedy, that literacy without context could indeed be dangerous. But he said that Father Cassian had a flaw in his logic. It wasn't literacy that caused the uprising. Deception caused the uprising. The peasants had been deceived for 200 years. Literacy simply allowed them to see it. If they hadn't been deceived, they would have read the tax decree, nodded, and paid. The problem isn't that the peasants learned to read. The problem is what was written in the documents they read. Cassian listened. His expression didn't change, but Daniel saw him turn the cup on the table. A quarter turn. A mechanical gesture of a man pondering what he has heard. Daniel continued. He said that his primer does not teach how to read tax decrees. It teaches how to read prayers. words that people already know by heart. It doesn't put new thoughts into their heads. It provides a tool. A hammer isn't to blame for the fact that it was used to kill a man. A hammer was made to drive nails. Cassian said that a hammer and a book have one thing in common. The one who made it doesn't control the one who uses it. Daniel agreed. He said it was true, and that this is precisely what makes books valuable. Because knowledge controlled by a single person is not knowledge. It is power. And power corrupts. Even the chancellery. Cassian set down his cup. He looked at Daniel for a long time. Then he said he would not arrest him today, but that he would remain in home guard and watch. And if he saw that Daniel's primers led to bloodshed, he would stop it, at any cost. Daniel stood up, bowed, walked toward the door, stopped at the threshold, turned around. Said that if Father Cassian saw that the primers led to bloodshed, Daniel stop on his own, without coercion, because he doesn't print books so that people will die. Cassian said nothing. Daniel went out. He walked down the street back toward the shipyard and felt his heart pounding. Fast, hard. He had just played the most dangerous game of his life. And won. For now. Cassian had given him time. How much, he didn't know, but it was more than 0. When he returned to the basement, Mary, Toby, and Lily were waiting for him. Mary rushed toward him, grabbed him by the shoulders, looked him over, made sure he was unharmed. Then she punched him in the chest, not hard, but with feeling. She told him never to do that again. Daniel replied that he would try. Lily asked what the Inquisitor had said. Daniel told her, briefly, without the details of the conversation about Talvin. He said Cassian wouldn't arrest him right now, but he would be watching. Lily thought for a moment. Then she said that keeping an eye on him was good. Keeping an eye on him meant Cassian wasn't sure. And an uncertain enemy was better than a certain one. She was 14 years old. Toby asked what had happened to the boy, Ren. Daniel froze. He hadn't asked Cassian about Ren. He'd forgotten, or was afraid to ask. He said he'd find out. Mary said quietly that she already knew. Ren had been released, without a brand. Cassian had interrogated him personally. The boy knew nothing except that another boy had given him the book at the pier. Cassian had let him go with a warning. Daniel exhaled. Then he sat down at the lathe and continued working. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange tension. Cassian was in town. His assistants roamed the streets. Guards inspected the boats in the harbor, but no one touched Edwin's workshop. No one came to the shipyard basement. Cassian was watching, just as he had promised. Daniel used this time. He finished typesetting the first volume of Serafina's notes, 60 pages, 320 plant descriptions. He printed 10 copies, on the finest paper, with wide margins, neatly typeset in small type. Mary had the cover bound in dark green leather. Each volume was a work of art. Serafina received her book that evening, via a messenger, in a canvas bundle. Daniel didn't see her open it, but Mary did. Mary had delivered the bundle personally. She told the story later. Serafina unwrapped the canvas. She saw the book. She picked it up. She opened it. She read the first page. She flipped through the pages. She read the second, and very slowly closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and began to cry, silently, without sobbing. Tears simply streamed down her cheeks as she stood there holding the book, unable to stop. Mary said she stood in the doorway, unsure whether to leave or stay. Serafina noticed her, wiped her face. She straightened up. She said thank you. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands trembled. Daniel listened to Mary's story and thought about 12 years. 12 years of notes in a locked drawer. 12 years of being certain that her thoughts weren't worth the paper they were written on. And here they were, 10 copies, in dark green leather, with her name on the title page. The spark from Serafina hadn't come. She was already literate. The system didn't count those who could already read. But Daniel knew that these 10 books were worth more than 10,000 sparks. Because Serafina was no longer just woman with a notebook. She was an author. And that changed everything. The 6th month began with Yuna's arrival. She came by sea, on a trading schooner from the eastern ports, small, quiet, with a bundle in her hands and burns on her fingers. Mary found her at the pier. More precisely, Mary found her paper. The woman was sitting on the dock selling sheets, thin, white, smooth, better than anything Daniel made from rags, better than Serafina's paper. Mary bought 5 sheets, brought them to the workshop, laid them on the table in front of Daniel. He took a sheet, ran his fingers over the surface, held it up to the light, looked at the light shining through, and froze. The paper was perfect. Thin but sturdy, smooth but not slippery. The paint would lie on it like a seal on wax. No smudges, no blurring. He asked Mary where she'd gotten it. Mary told him. Daniel took off his apron and went to the port. Yuna So was sitting in the same spot. 12 sheets of paper lay before her. She'd already sold 3. 9 remained. A pot of rice and chopsticks stood nearby. She ate slowly and calmly, like someone accustomed to eating once a day and taking their time. Daniel approached. He sat down beside her. He picked up a sheet. He examined it. He asked in the local language what she used to make the paper. Yuna looked at him. She answered with a strong accent, from the bark of the mulberry tree. Daniel nodded. Korean paper. Hanji. In his world, it was considered one of the best in history, stronger than European rag paper, more durable. A single sheet of Hanji could last 1,000 years without decaying. He asked where she was from. Yuna answered briefly,
The Eastern Islands. Her family made paper. 3 generations. Her family was killed. She left. Now she's here. Her voice was even, without emotion, like someone talking about the weather. Daniel knew that behind that evenness lay something best left unasked. He asked something else. Did she want to work? Yuna looked at him. She asked what kind of work. Daniel said, making paper, lots of paper, every day, for pay, for a roof, for food. Yuna thought for a moment. Then she asked why he needed so much paper. Daniel paused. Then he told the truth. For books. Yuna's expression didn't change. She asked what kind of books. Daniel answered, the kind anyone can read, even those who aren't allowed to. Yuna was silent for a long time. Then she gathered the remaining sheets. She put them in a bundle. She stood up. She said she would go with him. Daniel led her to the shipyard basement. Yuna entered. She looked around. She saw the machine. She walked over, not to the machine, to the stack of paper. She took a sheet of Daniel's rag paper. She looked at the light shining through it. She shook her head. Then she took a sheet of her own paper. She placed it next to it. The difference was like that between burlap and silk. Yuna said she needed certain conditions. Water, clean, plenty of it. Bark, a mulberry tree or a substitute. Something similar probably grows around here. A cauldron for boiling, frames for drying, and a place, right, with good ventilation. The basement won't do. Daniel looked at her, looked at the basement, looked at Mary. Mary understood without words. She said she knew a place. The second floor of an old warehouse, above the basement. The roof was thin, but the walls were intact.
and windows, 4 large windows. Light. Air. They went up to the second floor. Una walked in, looked around, nodded, said it would work. And that very day she started working. She worked differently than Daniel, quietly, methodically, without fuss. Every movement measured, every gesture precise. She found bushes on the riverbank outside town that yielded long, strong fibers. Not a mulberry tree, but close. She boiled the bark in lye, rinsed it, beated it with a stone on a smooth board, for hours, monotonously. Then she diluted the mixture in a vat of water. She scooped it up with a bamboo frame she had made herself from willow twigs. She lifted it,
turned it over onto the board, and started again. 20 sheets a day, then 30, then 40. Every sheet was perfect. Daniel printed a test print on Una's paper and felt his breath catch. The letters on this paper didn't just stand there. They were alive. Black on white, sharp, bright, every stroke visible, every serif legible. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. He showed Una the print. She looked, nodded, not a hint of emotion. Then she went back to work. Daniel stood there with the sheet in his hands, thinking about how he now had a paper master, a real master. Not him with his self-taught skills using rags and paste, but a person who knew paper the way Daniel knew the press, the way Mary knew bookbinding, the way Lily knew numbers. Everyone in their place. A week later, Daniel did what he had promised himself from day one. He asked Una to make a batch of paper with a watermark. Una didn't understand. There were no watermarks in her tradition. Daniel explained. A subtle design inside the sheet, visible only when held up to the light, like a master's signature, like a name embedded in the work. Una thought. Then she asked what the design was. Daniel said, So. Her surname, in the language of her people. 2 characters. Una froze. She stood motionless. Then she turned her back to him and stood that way for a minute. Daniel saw her shoulders trembling. Then she turned back. Her face was dry. Her eyes were red but dry. She said, All right. The next day she made a wire form out of thin copper wire. 2 characters. So. She attached it to the mesh on the frame. The first sheet with the watermark was ready by evening. Daniel held it up to the light. In the center of the sheet, 2 characters appeared in translucent lines. The surname of the family that had been cut off for making paper that was too good for too many people. Now that surname would appear on every sheet, on every book, on every primer, on every herbarium. The So surname had not died. It had become part of every page that would come out of this workshop. Una worked in silence until the end of the day. That evening, for the first time since she'd been at the workshop, she cooked dinner for everyone. Spicy, hot, unfamiliar. Toby sneezed and washed it down with water. Lily said it was the best meal of her life. Mary ate in silence and wiped away the tears streaming from her eyes due to the hot peppers. Una sat and watched them, and for the first time, something resembling calm appeared on her face. Hannah Park appeared like a storm, loudly, without warning, with laughter and the scent of sea salt. She came to the shipyard because she was looking for Una. They knew each other from the trade routes. Hannah's father traded with the Eastern Islands. Una knew his ships. Hannah found Una through the port merchants. She came to the warehouse. She saw the workshop. She saw the printing press. She saw stacks of books. And instead of being frightened or surprised, she asked how much a single copy cost and what the profit margin was for a print run of 500. Daniel looked at her and didn't know what to say. The merchant's 17-year-old daughter stood before him in men's trousers and a sailor's jacket and immediately asked questions about production costs. Hannah didn't wait for an answer.
She began calculating aloud. Paper, ink, lead, time, rent, food. She tallied all the expenses in a minute. She looked at Daniel and said he was operating at a loss. That giving away primers for free was noble, but foolish. That if he wanted the workshop to last longer than a year, he needed income. Lily stood nearby and nodded. She and Hannah understood each other instantly, like two predators of the same species. Daniel asked what Hannah was proposing. Hannah sat down on a barrel, crossed her legs, and began to speak. She proposed a two-tier model. Primers for free. That's the mission. That's the goal. That's why it all exists. But at the same time, the workshop prints commercial orders, commercial documents, contracts, receipts, invoices, everything that merchants have to write by hand over and over again. If Daniel can print forms with blank fields to fill in, merchants will buy them for silver, because it saves time. Time is money. Money is silver. Silver is lead and paper and food and the workshop's livelihood. Daniel thought for a minute. Then he said it was a good idea. Hannah said she knew, and that if he wanted, she was ready to handle sales. She speaks 6 languages. She knows every merchant in the port. She knows who pays on time and who doesn't. She knows who will keep quiet and who will run to snitch. Daniel asked what she wanted in return. Hannah fell silent, for the first time during the entire conversation. Then she said she wanted a book, not a primer, not a herbarium, a book for her, a journal, a trade journal, with ruled columns, with her name on the cover, so she could record deals, prices, routes, so that everything she carried in her head and feared forgetting would be on paper, so she could sleep at night. Daniel didn't understand the last sentence. Hannah explained. Her father had refused to teach her to write, because a wife doesn't write contracts. Hannah memorized everything by heart. Exchange rates, commodity prices in 10 ports, names of counterparties, terms of deals, deadlines, volumes, thousands of numbers, thousands of names, thousands of facts. Every night before bed, she would repeat them to herself, so she wouldn't forget. Because if she forgot, she would lose money. And if she lost money, her father would say that a woman shouldn't be in trade. And she fell asleep every night with the lamp on because in the dark, the words got jumbled and she started to panic that she had forgotten something important. Daniel listened and felt that familiar tightness in his chest. The same thing every time. Every person who came to him brought their own pain, and every pain was connected to letters, to their absence, to the ban on them, to a world that told half its population they were unworthy of writing down their own thoughts. He said he would make her a journal, the best journal in the world, with ruled columns, with her name on the cover, in the 6 languages she knows. Hannah looked at him. Then she smiled, widely, like someone who had finally received what she'd waited for her whole life and didn't believe she'd ever get. The journal was ready in 3 days. Mary bound it in brown leather. On the cover, Daniel had embossed the name, Hannah Park, in gold letters. Or rather, letters covered with a thin layer of yellowish paint made from ochre and egg yolk. Not real gold, but it looked dignified. Hannah took the magazine, opened it. She ran her finger along the ruled columns. She looked at the cover, at her name. And for the first time since they'd met, she fell silent. For a long time. Then she said one word. "Thank you." And she left. And she started working. In the first week, Hannah brought in 4 clients. The fish merchant ordered 500 invoice forms. The grain merchant ordered 200 receipt forms. The tavern owner ordered a menu. Yes, a menu. A list of dishes with prices, printed on a single sheet, to hang on the wall. The first menu in the history of Homegard. And the shipyard owner ordered 10 copies of the tide table. The money started rolling in, not a trickle like from Mary's paper, a flood. Silver poured into the workshop. Hannah took 20%. The The rest went toward production. Daniel bought more lead, more tin, more antimony. He cast 300 new typefaces. He built a third press, a small one, for small orders. Toby worked on it in the mornings while Daniel printed books on the big one. The workshop was expanding. The basement and the second floor of the old warehouse, 6 people: Daniel, Mary, Toby, Lily, Una, Hannah. 6 people and 3 presses and stacks of paper and type and ink and the smell of lead and linseed oil and the silence of the port city that was slowly learning to read. 5% of Homegard's population was now literate, compared to 3% nationwide. The counter read 48,400. Daniel checked the number every morning. Every new digit represented a person, a name, a face, a life that had changed. Cassian was watching too, in his own way. His assistants roamed the city. They counted the literate. They noted which children had suddenly started reading the signs, which women were whispering over a small book in the corner of the market. Cassian didn't interfere, not yet. He was waiting for blood. Just as he had said, he was waiting for the moment when literacy would turn into a revolt. And Daniel knew that if that moment came, Cassian would be right. And then it would all be over. So he did what he could. He didn't print slogans, not accusations, not calls for justice. He printed herbal guides, spreadsheets, primers for children, practical books, useful books. Books that make life better, not worse. Because if a person learned to read, and the first thing they read helped them cure their child's fever, or kept a merchant from cheating them at the market, then that person would be grateful to the letters, and not angry at the world. That was his strategy. Not a revolution, an evolution. Slow, quiet, irreversible. In the 7th month, Sister Yvette arrived. She did not come like Serafina, not through messengers and gloves. She came like a knife in the dark, quietly, precisely, dangerously. Daniel was working at night, alone. The others were asleep. He was typing up the final pages of the 2nd volume of Serafina's notes. He heard a sound on the stairs, light, almost inaudible. He picked up the hammer. He listened. Footsteps. A woman's. A single pair. A figure in a nun's habit appeared in the doorway. A white headscarf. A floor-length gray dress. A pale face. Downcast eyes. Daniel didn't lower the hammer. The nun raised her eyes. They were cold, clear, completely calm. She surveyed the workshop, the workbenches, the type, the paper, the drying sheets. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't frightened. As if she knew what she would see. Because she did. She introduced herself as Sister Yvette, a scribe of the office of the Word. 20 years in the scriptorium, half her life spent with pen and parchment. She said she had come from the Sours. Daniel froze. The Sours. A secret faction within the office, heretics in the ranks of heretic hunters. Those who dreamed of literacy for the people and were burned one by one in the town squares. Yvette said the Sours knew about him, had known for a long time, ever since the day Edwin received the forbidden book by mistake. The book had been planted on purpose. The Sours wanted Edwin to build a machine. They had been planning this for 10 years. They found a bookbinder who was smart enough and reckless enough. They planted the book with a description of the principle. They waited, and when Edwin was killed, they decided it was all over. And then they heard someone hammering again in Edwin's workshop. Daniel listened and felt the pieces falling into place that he hadn't been able to put together before. Edwin wasn't killed by accident. They found him because one of the Sours turned out to be the weak link. The Chancellery tracked down the channel through which the book was being passed. They got to Edwin. They killed him. But they didn't find the machine. Because the machine had been broken apart and looked like trash, and the real threat wasn't in the machine, it was in the principle, in the idea. And the idea didn't die with Edwin. It passed to Daniel. Yvette said the Sowers want to help. They have information, the Chancellery's search schedule.
The names of informants, patrol routes, a map of the network of informants and home guard. Everything needed to stay one step ahead of Cassian. Daniel asked what they wanted in return. Yvette fell silent. Then she spoke more quietly. She told him. 20 years ago, she began transcribing a treatise, an extremely rare one, the only copy. The Book of the Nature of Things, an ancient text on the structure of the universe. She had been transcribing it for 6 years, line by line, letter by letter, every day, 6 years of her life. When she finished the copy, the Chancellery destroyed the original, outdated interpretations. Then, 3 years later, they destroyed her copy as well, because the copy, too, had become outdated. 20 years of work, burned, twice. Yvette said she remembered the text, all of it, by heart. 240 pages, every word, every rune, every drawing in the margins. She memorized it not to recall it. She memorized it so that it wouldn't die. She wanted Daniel to print it, not just one copy, 100, 200, as many as it took to make it impossible to destroy. So that it would exist in the world not because the Chancellery allowed it, but because there were too many copies to burn. Daniel stood with a hammer in his hand and looked at the nun who had kept a book destroyed twice in her memory for 20 years. And he understood why she had come at night. Why alone? Why without warning? Because if the Chancellery found out, she wouldn't get a brand on her forehead. She'd get the pyre. He lowered the hammer. He said yes. Yvette nodded and began to dictate. That night they worked until dawn. Yvette spoke. Daniel wrote it down. Her memory was flawless. She wasn't just dictating words. She was dictating the arrangement of words on the page, the margin size, the spacing between lines. She was recreating the book not as text, but as a physical object. Because for a scribe, a book isn't about content. It's about form. It's a body of parchment and ink. And she remembered that body in its entirety. By dawn, Daniel had transcribed the first 20 pages. Yvette stood up. She adjusted her headscarf. She said she would return tomorrow night, and she left as quietly as she had come. Daniel stood in the pre-dawn light and thought about the world in which he lived, about a world in which a woman spends 20 years memorizing a book that had been taken from her, twice, and comes to a stranger's basement at night, risking her life so that this book might exist. He began typing that very day. The text was complex, archaic runes, symbols that weren't in his typeface. He carved new matrices, cast special letters, for runic signs, for diacritical marks, for symbols that, in Yvette's memory, looked like delicate curls in the margins but were actually formulas, magical formulas. Daniel realized this on the third day of typesetting. The Book of the Nature of Things was not just a treatise on the structure of the world. It contained basic magical formulas, the very formulas that granted power in this world, that were inscribed in one's blood from childhood, that cost 200 gold pieces per book, and which the Chancellery had destroyed not because they were outdated, but because they were too simple, too clear, too accessible. If a trained mage read this book, he would learn nothing new. But if a peasant who had just learned to read from Daniel's primer read it, then the peasant would learn that magic is not a divine gift of the chosen few. It is a skill, a formula, a sequence of symbols, just like letters in a word. And if you can read a word, you can read a formula. Daniel stopped typing. He sat down. He rested his hands on his knees, and he thought about what he was holding in his hands. It wasn't just a book. It was a bomb, an atomic bomb for the entire power structure of Valdrin. If this book spread across the country, the 7 great houses would lose their monopoly on magic. The Chancellery would lose its reason for existence. The world would change so much that the Talvin uprising would seem like a child's squabble. Cassian was right.
Literacy could lead to bloodshed. Not on its own, but in combination with this book. Daniel thought about it all night. By morning, he had made a decision. He would print the treatise. But not now, not today, not this year. He would hide the typeset. He would preserve the matrices. He would prepare everything.
But he would publish the book only when literacy in the kingdom reached a level at which knowledge would not destroy the world, but change it. When people not only learned to read the formulas, but also understood what to do with them. When education catches up with literacy, he told Yvette. She listened. She was silent for a long time. Then she said he was wiser than she had thought, and that she would wait. She had waited 20 years. She would wait some more. The first year was drawing to a close. Daniel was counting. 12 months, 3 machines, 6 people, 420 copies of the primer, 200 herbals, 150 spreadsheets, 10 copies of Serafina's notes, business forms, menus, invoices. The total print run had exceeded 2,000 copies. Literacy in Home Guard had reached 22%. The counter read 51,600. Rank D, 712 sparks out of 1,000. Another 288 to go before reaching rank C. But the numbers were only part of the picture. The picture was alive, breathing, unpredictable. 7 underground workshops had sprung up in other cities, not with his machines, with copies. Kana had found contacts, through trade routes, through the captains of ships that carried paper. Daniel had written detailed blueprints, how to build a press, how to cast type, how to make ink, how to set a page. The blueprints fit on 4 sheets that cost less than a silver coin and contained knowledge that changed the world. Hana smuggled the blueprints to 7 cities, through trusted people. A fishing schooner captain took a set north, a traveling merchant carried one east. A smuggler from the southern islands hid the sheets in the false bottom of a barrel of salted fish. Daniel did not control these workshops. He could not. He did not want to. He gave the blueprints and let them go, like seeds. He didn't know what would grow, but he knew something would grow. The first assassination attempt took place at the end of the 11th month. Daniel was walking from the workshop to Serafina's. He was carrying her the proof copies of the 2nd volume. The street was dark. An autumn evening. Rain. He didn't see the attacker. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned. The knife missed his throat and slashed the collar of his shirt. Daniel fell. Not from the blow, from fear. His legs simply buckled. He fell onto the wet stones and saw a figure in a dark cloak standing over him. Not the gray cloak of the chancellery. Dark, without insignia. A mercenary. The knife came down. Daniel rolled away. The knife struck the stone. Sparks. The man swung again. And then a stone flew out of the darkness. It hit the mercenary in the temple. He staggered. A second stone, in the knee. The mercenary fell. Lily darted out from behind the barrel by the wall, with a third stone in her hand. She didn't throw it. She waited. The mercenary got down on one knee. Lily hurled the stone. It hit the hand holding the knife. The knife flew away. The mercenary hissed in pain. He got up, ran, disappeared into an alley. Lily ran over to Daniel, asked if he was okay. Daniel lay on the wet stones and looked at the 14-year-old girl who had just saved his life with 3 stones. He said he was okay. Asked why she was here. Lily replied that she'd been watching him every evening when he went out, for a month now, because she knew this would happen. Because there was a bounty of 500 gold pieces on his head, and sooner or later, someone would try to claim it. Daniel sat down. He looked at the cut on his collar. Another centimeter and the knife would have gone into his neck. He was alive because a poor girl with stones had decided that his life was worth more than her safety. He said thank you. Lily shrugged.
She said he hadn't finished his work yet, and it was too early for him to die. They returned to the workshop. Daniel told the others. Mary turned pale. She pressed her lips together. She said nothing. Hannah cursed in 3 languages and said they needed security. Una silently pulled a short knife from her sleeve. Toby said he knew some guys at the port who would stand guard at night in exchange for food. Daniel looked at them, at his team. 6 people, each of whom risked their lives every day just by being near him. He said they needed to be more careful, that they needed to change their routes. Don't walk alone. Don't go out after dark. Standard precautions. He said this while thinking that caution wouldn't save him from House Valmont. Because the mercenary wasn't from the Chancellery. The Chancellery arrests and judges. It doesn't send out night assassins with knives. It was Valmont, the wealthiest of the 7 great houses,
Owners of the kingdom's largest library. People whose fortune depended on books being expensive, on the fact that a single book costs 200 gold pieces. And if Daniel's press became widespread, a book would cost 2 silver pieces, and the Valmont's fortune would collapse. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to scare him, to make him stop, or make him work for them. The knife in the alley was a warning. The next step would be an offer. It arrived a week later, a letter, delivered to Edwin's workshop, sealed with wax bearing the Valmont house coat of arms. Mary brought it to the basement. Daniel opened it. He read it. The House of Valmont was offering Master Edwin Hawthorne an exclusive contract. All the machines in the workshop would become the property of the house. All future inventions would belong to the house. Daniel would work only for the Valmonts. He would print only what they ordered. No primers, no herbalists, no books for the common people. Only luxury editions for the libraries of the nobility. In return, Valmont guarantees protection from the Chancellery, complete, absolute, and a reward. 1,000 gold pieces a year. Daniel read the letter, folded it, carried it to the press, placed it on the carriage, printed a single word over the text, no, dried it, sent it back with the same messenger. Hannah said he was crazy, that the Valmonts don't forgive refusals, that the next one to come wouldn't be a mercenary with a knife, but a squad with swords. Daniel replied that if he started working for the Valmonts, everything he was here for would lose its meaning. A machine that prints only for the rich isn't a revolution. It's a business. And he hadn't come for business. Mary stood nearby and said nothing. Then she quietly said that he was right, but that being right wouldn't protect him from a sword. Daniel agreed, and said that he needed allies, real ones, with power and with swords. He looked at the stack of letters from Seraphina, at the blueprints sent out to 7 cities, at Lily's map with the distribution points, and he began to plan. Seraphina found the allies, not Daniel. He was a craftsman. She was a noblewoman. In this world, that meant the difference between the one who knocks on the door and the one to whom it is opened. Seraphina came to the workshop 2 days after the Valmont's refusal, without a hood, for the first time. In the daytime, in a dark green velvet dress, with a book of her notes in her hand. She said she had sent the 2nd volume of her notes to 12 junior nobles in 4 cities, each with a personal letter. Each letter contained not only gratitude for their interest in botany, but also a subtle hint. If literacy among the common people reaches a certain level, the economy will change. Literate artisans produce more. Literate merchants calculate more accurately. Literate peasants pay taxes without middlemen. The middlemen are the lower nobility and officials who profit from the difference. If you remove the middlemen, the money will flow directly. More money, less theft. The economy grows, everyone wins. Except the middlemen. Seraphina wasn't calling for a revolution. She was offering a benefit, a financial one, a concrete one, a calculated one. Lily helped with the calculations.
A 14-year-old former beggar girl drew up an economic forecast that Serafina included in her letters. 3 columns. The estate's current income, projected income assuming a 20% literacy rate among the peasants. The difference. The difference was compelling. Of the 12 nobles, 7 replied.
3 refused. 7 did not respond. 7 said they wanted to know more. Serafina met with each one personally, behind closed doors, over a glass of wine, in a language the nobles understood: money, land, influence. A month later, Daniel had 7 allies among the nobility. Not close friends, not fighters for justice, investors. People who understood that a literate peasant is a more profitable peasant. People who were ready to defend the workshop not because they believed in enlightenment, but because they believed in profit. Daniel accepted this. There are no perfect allies. There are useful ones. The Valmonts sensed the change. The younger nobles who had previously depended on the Valmont libraries began to cancel their subscriptions to handwritten copies. Why pay 200 gold pieces for a book when a printed one costs 5 silver pieces? The Valmonts lost 3 contracts in a month, then 5, then 8. Money was draining away, slowly but noticeably. And then the House of Valmont split. The elder branch wanted to destroy the press, burn down the workshops, kill Daniel and everyone associated with him. The younger branch wanted something else. They wanted their own press. If printed books were inevitable, it was better to print them themselves than to lose out to the new market. The younger branch of the Valmonts sent a messenger to Daniel, not with a knife, with a proposal. Not an exclusive contract. A partnership. They would build their own workshop. Daniel would provide the blueprints and train the craftsmen. They would print books from their own library, luxurious editions for the nobility, and Daniel prints whatever he wants: primers, herbal guides, anything. No restrictions. 2 streams, 2 markets, 2 worlds, but one principle: many copies. Daniel thought about it for 3 days. He consulted with Mary, with Serafina, with Hannah. Mary said it was a trap. Hannah said it was business. Serafina said it was a necessity, because if the younger branch of the Valmonts got the press, they would stand between Daniel and the elder branch. 2 enemies are better than 1, if one of them is on your side. Daniel agreed. He handed over the blueprints to the younger branch of the Valmonts. He trained 2 of their craftsmen in a week. He showed them how to build a press, how to cast type, how to set a page. He let them go. 2 months later, the first legal printing press began operating in the kingdom's capital, under the Valmont coat of arms. It printed luxurious books for the nobility, expensive, beautiful, on the finest paper, with gold-edged pages, but printed, not handwritten. It was a turning point, because if House Valmont prints books, then book printing cannot be heresy. The logic is simple. Heresy is what heretics do, and the Valmonts are not heretics. They are one of the 7 great houses. Cassian understood this instantly. He went to Daniel, for the first time, into the shipyard's basement. He walked in. He looked around. He looked at the machines, at the stacks of books, at Una, who was making paper upstairs, at Toby, who was typesetting lines while humming, at Lily, who was counting the print run, at Mary, who was binding the notebooks. Then he looked at Daniel and said that he was smarter than he thought. Daniel replied that he wasn't smart, he's stubborn. Cassian almost smiled. Almost. Then he said that the Valmonts were printing prayer books, and that the Chancellery was forced to approve it, because banning the Valmonts would mean declaring war on one of the 7 houses, and the Chancellery cannot wage war against the houses. It can only wage war against weavers in the basements. Daniel heard bitterness in those words, real bitterness. Cassian wasn't a fool. He saw that he was losing, not to Daniel, to time. The world was changing.
Machines were multiplying, books were getting cheaper, literacy was rising, and it was already impossible to stop it. Cassian sat down on a stool. He accepted a cup of tea from Una, took a sip, winced at the sharpness, and said one sentence. He said he hoped Daniel was right, that literacy wouldn't lead to bloodshed, that people who learned to read wouldn't take up swords, that books would turn out better than he feared. Because if they turned out to be worse, the blame would fall on Daniel, on him alone. Daniel looked at the Inquisitor. He said he knew, and that he thought about it every day. Cassian nodded, finished his tea, stood up, and left. He didn't arrest him. He didn't threaten him. He just left. The second year brought war. Not the one Cassian feared, a different one, a quiet one, a paper war. The office of the Word split irrevocably.
The Guardians, led by the Supreme Canon, demanded a ban on all printed books. The Sowers, whose numbers had grown after Iveta began secretly coordinating them from Daniel's workshop, demanded reforms. Standing between them were the Pragmatists, who wanted neither one nor the other, but wanted to see which way the wind was blowing before choosing a side. Cassian was among the Pragmatists. This surprised Daniel. He had expected the Inquisitor to side with the Keepers, but Cassian proved more honest than his cassock. He saw that the world had changed, that printing presses stood in the 7 cities, that literacy was on the rise, that it was no longer possible to ban things, and he didn't want to side with those who would lose, not out of cowardice, out of logic. Cassian came to Daniel and proposed a deal, an impossible one, an unthinkable one. He proposed that the Chancellery become a publisher. Daniel didn't believe him. He asked him to repeat it. Cassian repeated it. The Chancellery prints prayer texts, officially, on its own presses, under its own control. It controls the content. It does not control the technology. This allows the Keepers to save face. They still decide what can be printed and what cannot. But how to print is no longer their concern. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. It was dangerous. A chancellery that publishes is a chancellery that censors with a printing press. But it is also a chancellery that has recognized book printing, officially, forever. After that, it is impossible to ban the press. It's like banning your own weapon. He agreed, on one condition. The Chancellery prints whatever it wants, but it doesn't forbid others from printing. No monopolies, no exclusive rights. Free printing alongside official printing. Cassian said it would be difficult. Daniel said he knew. Cassian said he would try. The negotiations took 3 months. 3 months of letters, meetings, arguments. Yvette relayed information from the Chancellery. Serafina negotiated with the nobles. Hannah secured funding. Lily did the accounting. Mary sewed. Toby typeset. Una made paper. Everyone in their place. While the negotiations were underway, the orcs from the north sent a delegation. 3 shaman scribes, huge, with runic tattoos on their arms and faces. They came to Homgard and asked to meet the man who makes books out of iron. Daniel met them in the workshop. The shamans looked at the machine with the same expression Toby had when he saw the first letter. Amazement, delight, thirst. The elder shaman spoke, in broken local language. He said that the orc clans want their own books, in their own language, with their own runes. Their shamans pass down knowledge orally, generation after generation, and with each generation something is lost, a word, a formula, a song. They want to stop the losses. They want to write it down. They want to print it. Daniel looked at the orc runes, complex, angular, not at all like the local alphabet. He activated the system's skill, font recognition. The runes broke down into strokes before his eyes, basic elements, verticals, horizontals, diagonals, angles. Within an hour, he had drawn a matrix for the first 10 runic letters. He showed it to the shaman. The shaman looked at it. Then he looked at Daniel. Then at the letter.
Then he dropped to one knee. He did not bow. He knelt as a warrior before one he recognized. And he uttered a word in the Orcish language that Daniel did not understand, but which Hannah translated later. Keeper of Voices.
Daniel stood before the kneeling Orcish shaman and thought that for this moment alone, it had been worth dying on the wet highway in O. He had made a set of Orc letters in a week, 40 runes, 3 additional symbols for intonation marks. He printed a test page, Orc text on paper with the So watermark. The shaman took 10 copies, and the machine blueprints. The Orcs were heading north with a wooden box containing the letters. 4 Orc warriors carried the box as if it were a sacred relic. Daniel watched them go and thought that in a year's time, the machine would be standing in the north, and Orc children would read their runes from a printed page, and no great house and no chancellery would be able to stop it. Because try taking a book away from an Orc. Sparks flew. The counter jumped. Not from the Orcs. The Orcs hadn't yet learned to read from his books. From Halmgard, from the 7 cities, from children who taught their parents, from women who taught their neighbors, from old men who learned from their grandchildren. Literacy in the kingdom had surpassed 30%. The counter flashed. Rank upgraded. D becomes C. New technologies. The rotary press.
Daniel looked at the blueprint of the rotary press, and his head spun. It wasn't just an improved version. It was a different principle. Not a flat press, cylindrical. The paper passes between 2 rollers. A mold with letters is attached to one roller. An impression roller is attached to the other. Printing speed increases tenfold. 100 pages per hour become 1,000. He began building the rotary press that very day. King Ethelmar IV died at the end of the 3rd year, quietly, in his sleep, just as the physicians had predicted. The heir was weak and indecisive. The 7 great houses began a struggle for the regency. But the struggle did not go as everyone expected, because the world had changed. 30% of the literate population is not 3%. 30% is 1 in every 3 people in the kingdom who can read a decree, who can compare the promises of the contenders, who can discuss what they've read with a neighbor rather than repeat a rumor heard at the market. The Regency Council gathered in the capital, the 7 houses, the chancellery, representatives of the cities, and for the first time in Valdrin's history, those who had never been invited before were seated at the table. The Halmgard Printers Guild. 3 people, Daniel, Hannah, and a representative of the younger branch of the Valmonts. 3 people who controlled what everyone else feared: information. Because while the houses argued over the regency, Daniel's workshops were printing. Every day. News, decrees, announcements. Everything that had previously been conveyed by town criers and distorted beyond recognition now lay on paper. Accurate. Unchanging. The same in Halmgard, in the capital, and in the mountain village on the border with the Orc lands. The houses didn't like it. They didn't like that peasants were reading the same decrees they were. They didn't like that artisans were discussing tax policy. They didn't like that printed sheets with news hung in taverns, and people gathered around them to read aloud to those who couldn't yet read. But they couldn't stop it. Because 23 printing houses in 14 cities isn't just a basement and a shipyard. It's an industry. It's jobs. It's taxes. It's the economy. Banning printing now would mean destroying the economy that feeds the army. And without an army, the crown cannot be held. Logic trumps desire. Daniel sat at the Regency Council table and remained silent. Others spoke. Kana led the negotiations, in 6 languages, switching between them as if they were instruments, with each house in its own language, with the Orcish ambassador in Orcish, with the Eastern trade representative in Eastern. Seraphina sat nearby, silent, observing, taking notes. Her second book on botany had become a bestseller among the nobility. 40 copies had sold out in a week. Her name was known.
Her opinion was respected. A woman at the council table, for the first time in history, not because they had called her, because they couldn't not call her. The council lasted 3 days. Decisions were made. The regency would be collective, a council of the 5 houses. The heir would remain a nominal king. And most importantly, book printing was legalized, officially, by decree of the Regency Council, with one condition. The Office of the Word would have the right to review texts in advance. Not a ban, a review. Advisory oversight, not prohibitive. Daniel knew this was a compromise. He knew the office would try to turn advisory into mandatory. He knew the fight wasn't over. But legalization was a fact, a legal fact, printed on paper, signed by the 5 houses, sealed with seals. It couldn't be revoked quietly, only loudly. And loudly means war, and nobody wants war. After the council meeting, Cassian approached him. They stood in the town hall corridor, just the 2 of them. Cassian said there had been no bloodshed, that Daniel had been right, that literacy hadn't led to an uprising. Yet. He emphasized that word. Yet. Daniel nodded, said he understood. Cassian paused, then said one more thing. Said he'd read Seraphina's journals, both books, and that they were beautiful, and that he regretted that the world had deprived itself of the voices of half its population for so long. Daniel looked at him. Cassian turned and walked away. When Daniel returned to Halmgard, a surprise awaited him. The system had sent him a new message. For the first time in 3 years. Not sparks, not a rank, a new objective. The line glowed blue, the ultimate goal of the Enlightener System. To restore the lost heritage.
To open the sealed libraries of an ancient civilization. Number of repositories, 7. Access key. Literacy rate of the continent's population over 50%. Current level, 34%. Daniel stood reading these lines and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. An ancient civilization. 7 repositories. Libraries sealed and waiting. Waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to open them. Waiting for literacy. The Office of the Word was created to erase the traces of this civilization. And it had almost succeeded. Almost. Because the system had survived. It had reached across worlds. It had found him and brought him here. Not so that he could print primers. The primers were a means. The goal was the repositories. Knowledge that had waited 1,000 years. He sank into a chair. He looked at the workshop, at the machines, at the typefaces, at the stacks of books, at the paper with the "So" watermark, at everything he had built over 3 years. And he realized that this was only the beginning. The burning of books in Halmgard's main square was the keepers' final blow. They knew they had lost. They knew the legalization decree had been signed. They knew that 23 printing presses were operating in 14 cities. They knew that literacy was growing every day, but they couldn't leave in silence. They needed a gesture, a symbol, the last cry of a drowning world. They brought 300 copies of Daniel's primers from the confiscated stockpile. They stacked them in a pyramid in the square, doused them with oil. The high cannon read a curse, lit a torch, threw it. The fire flared up. The paper burned quickly, voraciously. Black smoke rose toward the sky. The smell of burning pages drifted over the square. Daniel stood in the crowd, unarmed, with no allies nearby, only Toby on his left, Mary on his right, and Lily behind him. He watched his primers burn. Each one he had typeset himself. He had set every letter on the typesetting machine with his own hands. He had pressed every sheet into the mold. Mary had sewn every notebook together with her fingers, scarred from the awl. They were burning.
and he stood and watched, and said nothing. And then a man stepped out of the crowd, an old man, a fisherman, hands like ropes, a face darkened by wind and sun. He approached the fire. He pulled a notebook from his bosom.
Not a printed one, a handwritten one. Several sheets bound with thread, clumsy letters written by an unskilled hand. He threw the notebook into the fire. He stepped back. He stood next to Daniel and spoke softly. He said it was his copy, that he had copied the primer by hand, from memory, at night by candlelight, for his grandson, because his grandson wants to read. And if they burn all the printed primers, he'll copy another one, and another, as many as it takes, because now he knows how to write. A woman came out behind the old man, a midwife from the outskirts. She threw a handwritten herbal guide into the fire, her copy. Behind her, a boy of about 12. He threw a handwritten multiplication table. Behind him, another, and another, and another. People stepped out of the crowd one by one. Each carried a handwritten copy, a primer, an herbal guide, a table, a prayer. A page from Seraphina's notes, hand-copied with mistakes and smudges. They threw their copies into the fire. 100, 200, 300, 500. Handwritten copies, made by hand, at night, from memory, by people who had learned to read and write over the past 3 years. They threw them into the bonfire, and every throw said the same thing: burn. I still have more. I'll rewrite it. You can't burn what's in my head. The archcanon watched this, and his face changed. Anger, confusion, fear, understanding. 500 handwritten copies. That meant 500 people in one city didn't just know how to read. They knew how to write. They could reproduce the book. Without a press, without type, without paper. With their hands, in their heads. A printing press can be broken. A workshop can be burned down. A master can be killed. But you can't climb into the head of each of those 500 people and cut the letters out of there. Guards stood around the square. They didn't move. They couldn't. Before them were people with books in their hands, not with swords, not with pitchforks, with notebooks. To cut down a crowd with primers would mean admitting that they feared letters, and only those who know that letters are stronger than swords fear letters. Silence. The bonfire crackled. The paper burned out. Black flakes flew toward the sky. And in that silence, Toby took a step forward. He was 16. 3 years ago, he had cried, holding his hands the first sheet with a prayer. A boy who didn't know a single letter. Now he stood before 1,000 people. In his hands he held a book. His book, which he had typed himself, letter by letter, page by page. A new style primer, an expanded one, with exercises, with stories, with little tales about a boy from the port who was learning to read. About a boy very much like Toby himself. Toby opened the book and began to read aloud. His voice was quiet at first. Then it grew stronger. Then it rang out. He read smoothly, without stumbling, without pauses. The words flowed like water, clear, crisp. 1,000 people listened, in silence. Not a single one moved. Not a single one coughed. They listened as one listens to music, like they listen to rain after a drought. Daniel stood and watched the boy who 3 years ago didn't know a single letter, and now was reading his own book in the square in front of 1,000 people. And he felt something hot and immense rising in his chest and filling him completely. This was what he had come here for. Not machines, not print runs, not sparks, not ranks. This.
the boy reading, the people listening.
Words that no one could ever take away. Toby finished. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then the square erupted. Not with shouts, not with applause, with whispers. 1,000 people were whispering to each other, in each other's ears, words that Toby had just read. They passed them on, in a chain, from person to person. The words spread across the square like ripples on water, and in the midst of that whispering stood Father Cassian. Daniel saw him, in the 3rd row, in a black cassock, with an inscrutable face. Cassian stood and listened, and when Toby finished and the whispering died down, Cassian slowly raised his hand, very slowly. He took off his hat, a simple gesture a man takes off his hat. Not a word, not a bow, not a smile. He simply bared his head before the boy who was reading. He didn't give in. No, Cassian isn't the type to give in. He acknowledged it. Acknowledged that the world had changed, that the letters had won, that the boy in the square was more important than an inquisitor in a cassock. Daniel looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Toby. Toby looked at the book in his hands. Mary stood next to Daniel and wept silently. Lily wasn't crying. Lily was counting the people in the square. 1,200. Hannah stood off to the side and wrote in her trade journal the number, the date, the event. The first public reading in the history of Halmgard. Una stood motionless. She looked at the bonfire, at the smoldering paper, at her watermark, which was visible on the charred pages. So, her surname was burning. And it wasn't burning away because it stood on thousands of other pages throughout the kingdom. Yvette stood in the shadows by the wall, in a nun's habit, with her eyes downcast, and she was smiling, for the first time in 20 years. Serafina stood on the town hall balcony. She looked down from above. In her hands was her book, a green cover, her name on the title page. 12 years of entries that now existed in the world, in hundreds of copies, forever. Numbers swam before Daniel's eyes. The counter came to life. Sparks poured forth in a torrent. Not 1, not 10, not 100. Thousands. Thousands of people across the kingdom were putting letters together into words at that very moment. Children in mountain villages, women in coastal towns, old men in harbor taverns, orc teenagers on the northern plains. All of them were reading, right now, at this very second. The counter flashed numbers. 48,000, 50, 100, 200, 300,000. The numbers grew. They accelerated. Every number was a name, a face, a life. The number of literate people in the kingdom went from 47,814 to 312,446. Rank upgraded. C becomes D. No. C becomes B. No. Higher. The counter flashed one last time. Rank upgraded. C becomes B. New technologies available. Lithography. The typesetting machine. Daniel stood in the square. The bonfire was dying down. The crowd was dispersing. People were carrying books away with them, handwritten and printed, hiding them under their coats, carrying them home, placing them on the table, opening them. They read aloud to their children by candlelight. And each of them was proof that Cassian was wrong. Literacy did not lead to bloodshed. It led to whispers in the square, to the midwife's tears as she read the name of the herb, to the fisherman who counted his change and smiled, to the boy who read the book aloud, and to the 1,000 people who listened to him. Daniel stood and watched the dying bonfire, and he smiled. Truly, for the first time in 3 years. Mary walked up to him, stood beside him, said nothing, just stood there.
Then she quietly spoke 5 words. The thread passes through the skin. The first sentence she had ever read in her life. Daniel looked at her. Mary looked at him. And there was no more fear in her eyes, no shame, no hunger. There was calm. The calm of a person who had found what they had been searching for their whole life. They stood in the square, just the two of them. All around, the city that could read was bustling. And somewhere far to the north, an orcish boy sat by the fire and traced his finger over the runes on a printed sheet. And in the east, a girl in a mountain village read aloud to her father by candlelight. And in the south, an old man in a harbor tavern held a primer in his hands and whispered his first word. And that was normal. It was an everyday occurrence. A person is reading a book. Nothing special. And yet the most important thing that has ever happened in this world. Daniel turned toward the workshop, toward the machines, toward the typefaces, toward the paper with the "So" watermark.
Toward the people waiting for him there. Toby, Lily, Hannah, Una, Iveta, Serafina. His team. His family. Ahead lay 7 repositories of an ancient civilization. Ahead lay a 50% literacy rate. Ahead lay work. Lots of work. But that was for later. Right now, he just stood there looking at the city and smiling. Because in 20 years, a peasant boy in a mountain village would be reading aloud to his father in the evening.